Alright, welcome in here. Today we're looking at Unit 2, Classical Era in World History. We're talking 500 to 500 BC. It is so important for you to keep in mind the time frame. Although Chapter 4, 5, and 6 are pretty much the same time frame, and 7 is similar in some ways. But 4, 5, and 6, all Eurasian empires, although it's similar in time frame, it is... I'm telling you, it is going to be tough for you at the end of the year to keep this all in perspective. And when they ask you a test question that says in 500 BC or 500 CE, and they don't give you Eurasian empires, you almost have to have the dates be synonymous or equate to the chapters. So I know we're used to having some teacher tell you you don't have to know dates, but those days are over with because this is advanced placement and they hold you to pretty high standard as we have discussed. But let's look at the Greek city-states versus the Persian Empire, which helps to lead to Alexander the Great. And how great was he? We talked about that today in class some. What are some common features that are found in all empires? From Empires Strike Back to the dark side there. Come to the dark side, we have cookies. That might not be a bad idea. All empires have these things. They control large areas and populations. And you'll see we have a lot of these to cover here in this chapter. Empires like the ones that are easy to remember because they have empire in their name. Mauryan Empire. You weren't thinking that one. The Roman Empire. Persians have an empire. Do the Greeks have an empire? Boy, that's a good question. We're going to start looking at that here in a second. That is a good question. Is it an empire, or did they expand much or not? Do they control really large areas of population, or are they just little city-states? Is China an empire? That's also a little bit of a tricky question because they'd like to just kind of be China, but they do spread and have influence in other areas. How about this? All empires were brought together by conquest and funded in part by... Every time I hear that or read that, I just think we're like talking PBS here. Funded in part by concerned viewers like you. But funded in part by extracting wealth from conquered people. Isn't that friendly? So basically they steal what they have or take what they need. All empires stimulate the exchange of ideas and cultures and values among the peoples that they conquer, and this is something you'll see in Andrew Marr's video on Age of Empires. We'll watch that in class. Andrew Marr's thesis is, yes, the classical era was pretty darn disastrous in terms of war and death and famine and disease and all these kinds of things that happened. A great number of people died. However, he says an awful lot of great technology, ideas, and advancement that pushed the human story down the road here quite a bit happened during this time period. So although there was this terrible war-like situation and expansion, because you're having expansion occur, you're pulling more people together and sharing more and potentially, as he says, pushing the human experience further down the road. He says more than if there wouldn't have been war and conflict. That's his thesis, that's his idea. He's going to try to prove that to you. You may disagree with him, so prove it. Also, all empires seek to foster an imperial identity that transcend the more local identities and localities that they control. This means that you want an identity of the Roman Empire, that people know they're Roman. Maybe a similar coinage system and system of weights so that trade is simple. Maybe you want to send representatives to Rome to meet in the Senate and to help govern. But yet they may let people keep their own local identities, if that makes some sense. Maybe not have a national language or religion for the Roman Empire, which they don't necessarily have. I mean, they really don't. That's part of the strength of an empire, if you can let people continue to maybe believe in the cultural traditions that they've followed, or keep a national identity, but they're still a part of the whole. And that might be similar in America. You think of Texas, or Texas in America, is a different state or country within the country compared to, let's say, New York or California. Very different, maybe similar large states, but they have a very different cultural identity on the whole. All empires ultimately collapse, as Darth Vader witnessed. I won't give it away the ending here. He was somebody's father. Now, this is where I typically ask who has seen Star Wars. So, a couple of you haven't. Which maybe I should just make that part of the summer reading. Maybe not. Does it hurt you if you haven't seen Star Wars? Not really. But it might help you in terms of knowing what an empire is. The empire is Darth Vader. The empire is the dark side. And the rebels are the ones who are rebelling against that force. Empires can be pretty nasty. And in some ways, Rome itself, being a republic at first, and isn't that word interesting? The Republic. That's what you hear in Star Wars. Rome transforms, and we'll get to this more later, from a republic to an empire. And people see empire as bad. Doesn't necessarily have to be. As the Persian Empire is going to show us right here. So you see the Persian Empire at the top, a king there in the middle. I think he's an actor portraying one. And then at the bottom all the way to some more carvings from the Persian Empire. The Persians have an imperial political system comprised of Mesopotamian polities. That's not a typo. Polities means, groups of people or cities, city-states, including Babylonia and the Assyrian empires. It's far larger than its predecessors, stretching from India to Egypt, and it rules over a span of 35 million people. So it doesn't quite go to the Indus River Valley, and if you see the map up here, it's hard to see, but the Indus River Valley is right there at the edge of this, but it's pretty darn close. So it stretches from the Indus River Valley through Mesopotamia and into Egypt, and most of Egypt. So most of what we studied in Unit 1, the Persian Empire has under their own control. And you can see in this example here, they're showing you parts of Greece that it also encapsulates. So it features an elaborate cult of kingship in which the emperor was secluded in royal magnificence and was approachable only through an elaborate ritual. And this is something that they played up tremendously to build up this king of kings. The absolute ruler possessed a divine right to rule, meaning he gets his right from God, and you know who that is. It's Ahura Mazda. You might be saying to yourself, Ahura Hua, but this is the religion of the Persian Empire. Is it an official religion? Yeah, it's the official religion in a way, but they allowed conquered groups to keep their religious identities. We'll get into that a little bit more in a few minutes, but the Ahura Mazda was the god of a religion called, anybody? Zoroastrianism. This may seem new to you since we don't learn about it anywhere else, but this happened. Effective administrative system in the Persian Empire that placed Persian governors or satraps in each of the 23 provinces, while lower-level officials were drawn from local authorities. This system was monitored by imperial spies. So this is very much like Star Wars in that way. There are spies. What's a satrap or satrapy? A satrapy is an area like a county or division of the empire. And a satrap is, in a way, a person set up to run that area. It's like a governor. Now, what they need to do in one of their important roles is to collect taxes. And so, the way I think of it is the satrap is like a trap set up that's going to grab the money and send it back down to the king. The policy of respect for the empire's non-Persian cultural traditions, so there's a good policy of respect. So, and in some way, they would have to be. To control an area this big for as long as they did, you would have to, like, be firm, and they were firm. Not as firm as the Assyrians before them, but they were pretty firm and tough. But they were also able to give people some things to keep them going, and you're not going to have people rebel against you if they feel like they still have their cultural identity. Maybe over time they'll feel more Persian, but initially they can keep some of their own religious ideals. So you see there the massive amount of land that is the Persian Empire at about 500 BC. And realize that that's the very beginning of our chapter. From 500 BC to 500 AD is what they call it in the olden days. But we call it 500 BCE before the Common Era, and then 500 CE during the Common Era. The Assyrians, and it says Assyria, Babylon, and what's today's Syria, and then Iraq. The Assyrians had an empire, and now this next stage of empire, the Persians, who have kind of in some ways morphed into this over generations, but because of conflict and war, the Persians are more over here in Iran, to give you some idea of where they get Persia from. The Persian Gulf is this area here. So right above the Persian Gulf, kind of next to Iraq, is Iran, and that's where we think of Persia in a lot of ways today. Saudi Arabia is on the other side today. So all of this territory from northern Africa and what we call the Middle East, stretching all the way north into Greece, and all the way back across the map into India, is the Persian Empire. So let's flip the page here and look at Greece. What were the Greeks like? Well, they had hundreds of independent little city-states of 500 to 5,000 male citizens. Now, they had other people, a lot of slaves, and women, of course, and lots of children, but the citizens, the ones who could vote and participate in their government in various formats. The Greeks didn't always have democracy in every single spot. They do in Athens, but they certainly don't in places like Sparta, like we'll talk about later on. So that's not an empire, is it? But it did expand along the coastlines and include some fishing villages, so the Greeks do have an expansive territory. They include this popular participation in public life, where you're going to have within a city-state participation of the citizens towards the government. And this varied in different forms. In Athens, of course, there were just about everyone who was a male was able to be a citizen who wasn't a slave. This participation is based on unique ideas of citizenship. It's free people running the affairs of the state, and equality of all before all citizens of the law. It's mostly an Athens, Greece idea, but it's so big and so important to the future of the planet, really, in the world politically, that we think of it as a Greek idea as well. And there we get to it. Athenian democracy was direct rather than a representative. So even at its height, it was far more universal, or far from universal, I should say, because like I mentioned before, well over half the population, including women, slaves, foreigners, were excluded from participation. They could not be a voter or participate in government. We'll see a little bit more of that this week when we look at Andrew Marr and also Bethany Hughes. We'll talk some about the age of democracy and the dawn of democracy in Greece. So what were the consequences for both of these sides when they go to war, the Greeks and the Persians? First, the failure of the Persian invasions of Greece had very little impact on the Persian Empire. It doesn't have really any impact at all. The only thing I could possibly stretch into this would be to say that if they could have crushed Greece and Macedonia to the north and taken that under their control, then maybe down the road later they're less susceptible to invasion with Alexander the Great. But I think that's a bit of a stretch. These things are pretty far away from each other in terms of time. The Greek victory, though, and they do defeat the Persians. This is a huge upset. This is like the Jets beating the Colts in Super Bowl III. This is like, let's think of a more contemporary example here. the Giants of a few years ago beating the Patriots when the Patriots were undefeated in the Super Bowl. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of this. I remember Villanova beating Georgetown in the NCAA basketball finals. That was a huge upset, and you probably weren't born yet. But these are massive upsets in sports and massive upsets in the world of war and conflict, where the Greeks could potentially defeat the Persians, which were way more powerful. But understand, the Greeks aren't attacking the Persians. The Persians are getting in boats and trying to get to Greece to fight, and so definitely Greece has a home field advantage, as we'll see. 20th century perception of the East and West divide, which we'll see here in a few minutes, divide up Europe. The West, Europe, and then later the United States and the Americas represent freedom, and this is a stereotypical representation, but it generally works. And then there's Asia, the other side of the globe, which is referred to as the East, and that represents despotism. And despotism or tyranny, the rule of one or few, compared to this free democracy. Now there are some holes in this, so we'll get there in a few minutes, but generally speaking, I understand the point. This is straight from Strayer. 50 years following the Greco-Persian Wars were the high point, or the height, of participation in the Athenian democracy, or what they refer to as the Golden Age of Athens. It was golden, yeah, but it wasn't as golden as we remember it being, especially because we kind of wash away the fact that slaves, and these aren't your typical notion of American slaves, like you think of American slavery and our special version of it with mostly being Africans enslaved. These were other Greek city-states that they would capture people, or Persians, or whoever in battle, and enslave them. Potentially sometimes North Africans, but most of the time just from other places of Greece. So the slavery, the fact that women had very few rights, especially in Athens, is a bit of a problem. But there were some great things that did happen. The Parthenon that you see there at the very top of the picture here was built. There's a life-size replica in Tennessee, of course, and you know that because you probably saw Percy Jackson, maybe. The Greek theater was born, and you see a picture and image of that just below. What the Greeks did do a great job of was creating entertainment on a vast scale. Now, who could go watch that? Only males, not women. But they were able to do some things in theater and through art and through writing that were, I think that they would work today, and they do work today. Some of the plays that were done then, they used some of the same techniques, gags or whatever, in some of the comedy and tragedies. Socrates is beginning his career as a philosopher, and I think that's a little bit of a misnomer in a way, because he was a sculptor, but he did philosophize quite a lot and walked around questioning everybody and getting in some trouble. Let's look at the consequences for both these sides that we encounter here between the Persians and the Greeks. And you see on the right there the Peloponnesian War. And that's going to be a consequence here. Peloponnese, that's right. And then you see on the bottom here, Philip of Macedon. That's Alexander's father. One-eyed Philip, because he got his eye sliced into because it was a battle scar, battle wound. And Macedonia, which you see in red here, ends up overtaking almost all of Greece, except for Sparta, right? And Byzantium up there. Of course, they're the unconquered Greek territory. But many people were allied with Philip at his death. So what are the consequences here? A Greek victory against the Persians radicalized the Athenian democracy. In some ways made them think that they were better than the rest. And I'm not really sure why that happened and occurred, but there seemed to be some bitter resentment, especially between Sparta and Athens. We're going to look more deeply at the differences and the comparison between Athens and Sparta in the next video. Athens was defeated in this new Peloponnesian War, this bitter civil war, although it's kind of hard to tell that because both sides were beaten down so badly by the war, which lasted for, I think it was 30 years. Pretty sure that was the time period, or something close to that. There was terrible famine and disease, a massive epidemic of death and sickness in Athens, where they had mass graves, not just because of the war, but because of the sickness and illness that spread throughout Athens. And many people believe that what Athens was after the Peloponnesian War was just a crumbled ruin to begin with. This infighting ultimately opened the way for the Macedonians then to come from the north and conquer the Greeks. But this is a little bit difficult to quite understand too, because the Macedonians, most of them didn't consider themselves Greek. They were more like, as the Greeks would say, barbarian-like. They were from the north. But Philip and Alexander were people who were well-versed in Greek culture, and Alexander was a person who learned straight from Aristotle, who learned from Plato, who had been taught by Socrates. So there's a continuation here. Great video on the Persians and the Greeks by John Green. We usually see a little bit of this in class, but if you want to watch the rest of it, I highly recommend it. What about Alexander? He's the next person on the stage here, and really, after the Greco-Persian Wars lead to the Peloponnesian Wars, it's Alexander's time for war. He leads conquests over a huge population of Greece, and then he takes that war to Persia. Alexander grew up on the Greek mythology and legends of Homer, not Simpson, but the writer who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, and these stories of what Persia was like from Herodotus, from the first Greco-Persian wars, and from Thucydides, who wrote about other wars. Alexander kind of looked up to and idolized some of these Persian kings, especially Cyrus and Darius. The major avenue for the spread of ideas was these many cities that were created. I think there were 70 some different cities or hamlets created by Alexander that spread then throughout the Asiatic world into what was called then the Hellenistic world. Why Helen of Troy, and Hellenes are what the Greeks call themselves. They didn't call themselves the Greeks, called them Hellenes. After the idea of what Helen of Troy and the Greeks had represented. So this is the vast empire of Alexander the Great from 334 to 323 BC. He did not have a long life, but the life that he led, there's probably never been a military commander as successful in the history of the planet. One single person. The Mongols are going to be pretty successful here come later on down the road, but he successfully himself leads invasions of place after place that no one thought could ever be taken, and he does do it. You see the movie at the top there called Alexander. The greatest legend of all was real. It's an Oliver Stone picture that, if it was probably 30 to 45 minutes shorter, would have been a fantastic movie. There were some really good parts. There were some really incredibly bad parts of that movie. So you win some, you lose some. Angelina Jolie, Val Kilmer, Colin Farrell, Rosario Dawson. I'm not sure who the Leto guy is. I don't know him as well. But Anthony Hopkins. I mean, you're talking about some serious actors in this movie. So this is the front end of his invasions, and you see the conquest course from across the top of Macedon. He takes these armies into Byzantium, which is what they call this territory right here, Thrace as well. But then they come in and they cross over the strait. They get into what they call Ionia, which is this coastline here, from Lydia all the way to Gordon. And the Gordian's knot was what they called this legend. And he who untied the Gordian knot would be the ruler of them all. And the legend is that Alexander the Great was able to untie the knot, or cut the knot. Was he able to, or was it just a story? Who knows? There's a lot of legend with Alexander. He continues through Persia and comes down through Syria, conquering still, and into Egypt, and conquers Egypt. He's named a pharaoh of Egypt, which is just hard to even comprehend. He creates the town of Alexandria in Egypt. He moves back up through and goes through Jerusalem, the holy cities again, into Damascus, into the northern part of Mesopotamia and winning battles at Gargamella. He comes down through the Tigris River and into Babylon. He conquers Babylon and then to Susa. And the rest of the map here you see he's moving along. Here's Susa again. Moving along to Persepolis, which was kind of the capital of the Persian Empire there by the Persian Gulf. He moves north and takes on territories all across the north. He goes down into Susia, into Aria. These are some very difficult portions of the world to invade and to go through. This is territory that we have been fighting in since the Iraq War. Pakistan, Afghanistan, territories that never fall under one ruler like Afghanistan. It's been battled upon for such a long time period. It's such a tough territory, Iran and Afghanistan and these other places. So all the way up here in the northern parts, and you can see he kind of circles back here along the Indus River Valley. He pushes through the Indus River Valley. He's in that area, and then he comes back through. He's on his way back when he gets to Babylon. And you see 324, there's the little arrow there. And that is where, and there's another little arrow here, this is the fleet returning with him. Where in 324, I believe that's the year that he dies of fever in Babylon. It probably was typhus or something like that. The legend is that he died of a broken heart because his men wouldn't fight anymore. They said, we're tired of being on the road all the time. Let's go home. Let's enjoy the spoils of our victory. If you look at the map there of what we like to call Afro-Eurasia, it's really the eastern portion of the globe. If you don't count the Americas, it's pretty much everything else. The massive blue area and red area there is Alexander the Great's empire. It doesn't really amount to much after his death. They split it up amongst his people, and what it ends up becoming a situation where you've chunked it up and given it to different people, and they don't manage it very well after Alexander is gone, and it kind of fades away and the empire falls apart one by one. Really good one on Alexander the Great here by John Green as well. It's definitely worth watching. Although the test won't have a lot on Alexander the Great, it's still good to kind of put it into perspective and a fascinating person to study. So that is, in a nutshell here, the notes for Unit 2, Classical Era in World History, the Eurasian Empires. We're going to do another one here in a little bit on Sparta and Athens and comparing the two of them. That is an interesting discussion because Sparta and Athens couldn't be much different, could they? One a democracy, the other an oligarchy, and they both go to war during the Peloponnesian War, and that creates the situation that allows Alexander to come down. So we'll look a little closer, we'll zoom in, as Strayer would say, we'll focus in tighter and look at just the Greek city-states of Athens and Sparta and learn more about what it's like to be a Greek in Chapter 4, the Eurasian Empires. We'll see you next time. Until then, don't forget to be awesome.